in this century, no sovereign borrows money with the expectation that they will repay the money, if by repay you mean divert current resources from the budget in order to settle the liability. A sovereign in this century borrows in the sure and certain hope that when that bond, when that bond or loan matures, the sovereign will be able to go back into the market and borrow again to repay the maturing debt. And when that new bond matures, it'll do it again and again and again in perpetuity. It is fatuous to believe that the politicians in these countries are squirreling away the money to repay their existing indebtedness on the maturity date. They are all assuming it can be refinanced, to use the jargon. It can be paid back with the proceeds of a new borrowing when it happens. Now, that injects enormous fragility into the system. There are a variety of things that can happen that may prevent a country from being able to refinance its debt. The markets may turn arthritic and decide that they no longer wish to take the risk of lending to emerging market sovereigns. Interest rates can go up. The country's economy can suffer some kind of shock. A particular affliction of countries that are whose economy is based on a primary commodity export like oil or bauxite or copper. Something can go wrong elsewhere in the world. And all of a sudden, the investor community wakes up and says, my gosh, if that could happen to Mexico, if that could happen to Argentina, perhaps it could happen to Ruritania, let's make up a country. And that puts the debtor countries in a very delicate position. It means that you have maturing bonds that you cannot refinance from commercial sources. So what are your options? Your options, frankly, are find an official sector lender who's prepared to give you the money if you can. That was Greece's dilemma in 2010. But of course, they were a member of the European Union, and so the European Union was prepared to lend them the money to repay their maturing bonds for a little while. You can run down your reserves, and this is probably what every country does. You can hope that the circumstances that have denied you market access will pass, as long as you continue to show the market that you're paying your maturing debt. This often is a ruinous policy. Or the third option is you restructure your debt. You go to your existing creditors and say, folks, no one is prepared to lend us the money at a tolerable interest rate that would allow us to repay what we owe you. We don't have the reserves to continue to do this for more than a few weeks or a few months. And therefore, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to give us some form of debt relief. And we discussed what they are: principal haircut, coupon adjustment, maturity extension, probably some combination. And when you reach that point, then you're in the debt restructuring business.
Why do countries procrastinate about debt restructuring? Is it misplaced sense of vanity? Is it cultural? You've been dealing with sovereigns of all hues. What have you learned?
It is partly cultural. There are countries and areas of the world that regard a sovereign debt crisis as dishonorable. I have a vivid recollection of 1997 in South Korea. They had put up buckets on street corners, and people would come by and take off their gold wedding rings and throw them into the bucket in order to try to help the government avoid the dishonor of a debt restructuring. There are other parts of the world where restructuring the money lent by gringos is nearly as popular as soccer. And there is no particular shame attached to the exercise. You ask, why do politicians delay? Look, most politicians know that the politicians who lead a country into a sovereign debt restructuring are rarely the ones who take them out of it. It is an inherently disagreeable process. It will almost assuredly involve fiscal adjustment measures that are politically unpopular. No politician wants to do that. I remember I was called once to see a finance minister, and we had a chat, and they had not defaulted. And in the old days, accepted wisdom was you had to default to show your creditors the seriousness of the situation. Modern theory is exactly the opposite. Modern theory recommends what's called preemptive debt restructurings. Restructure before you default, because once you default, things get a lot more complicated, lawsuits begin. So I had this conversation with this minister, and I ended it. I said, "Sir, let me commend you that you are dealing with this problem in advance of it becoming a howling crisis, forcing you to default." He said, "Son," he said, "don't you think if I could hand this bag of garbage was not the word he used, to the next administration, I would do it?" He said, "but unfortunately, we don't have an election for another 8 months, and we don't have the money to last 8 months. And I said, "I understand, Minister." But look, there's something in the DNA of the political flesh that wants these disagreeable things to happen to your successor, not to you.
How long does a restructuring process typically take? What impact will this have on private market access, i.e. trade finance for private actors?
Yeah. How long? How long is a piece of string? It can take as little as 11 months from beginning to end. It can take much longer, depending on whether the process gets bogged down at one stage or another. Typically, the debtor country will want it to be done as quickly as possible. Look, sovereign debt restructurings are unpleasant experiences. If you're a local politician and are forced into one, and history, by the way, says that local politicians respond with pathological procrastination in these situations. Politicians would much prefer that the disagreeable task of restructuring the country's debt falls on the next administration, not on theirs. But if you're forced into it, typically you want it to be done as quickly as possible so that the memory of the pain of the debt restructuring and its associated fiscal adjustment is as distant from the next election as it can be in a temporal sense. Will it affect the private sector? Yes, certainly. normally the markets will see a sovereign ceiling in terms of the credit rating of private sector borrowers in the debtor country, that whatever the credit rating is of the sovereign, that gets reflected in the credit rating of private sector companies, unless they have a steady, reliable stream of foreign currency earnings offshore that they could use to service their external obligation. And even then, you see, the sovereign power is such that a species of capital controls could require local enterprises that have foreign currency earnings to repatriate those earnings and sell them up to the central bank. That type of capital control was used in Iceland, for example, after the financial crisis in 2008. So for so long as the sovereign is trapped in a debt restructuring, it is likely to make it more difficult, maybe impossible, for private sector enterprises to be tapping the international markets. And therefore, they too will wish the process to be completed as quickly as possible.
During a restructuring process, does the sovereign usually continue to service the debt, service interest? How does it work?
Sometimes. These are the so-called preemptive debt restructurings, where the sovereign does not default. Greece never defaulted. They came within 8 days of it, but they never defaulted. Uruguay, 2003, never defaulted. If it can be done, yes, that's probably desirable. The two things cutting against it are, first, this impression that creditors won't take seriously the situation and won't be prepared to entertain requests for deep debt relief for a country that is continuing to service its debt. And second, the time pressure in that scenario is wholly on the sovereign debtor, not on the creditors. You see, if you stopped paying and the creditors are missing coupons, the secondary market value of their bonds is declining. Every morning when they turn on their computers, they, to use Bill Clinton's phrase, feel your pain, because the secondary market price has dropped. That said, if it can be done, probably, all other things being equal, better to do it before a default. The default tends to build up accrued but unpaid interest. Creditors in a debt restructuring will always ask for that components to be paid in cash. So it's, if it can be done, probably better to do it before there's an outright default. And I think the longer term memory of the debt crisis is less indelibly stained if there hasn't been an actual default. What the market will remember is how the country conducts itself. Maturity, moderation, these are things the market will remember long after they've forgotten the level of debt relief that the country actually asked or received.